What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. This video is Female Factions Best Women's Stables. This video was suggested by Lorraine Diaz, so thank you very much. If you guys have any other suggestions, please put them in the comment section below or my post on my channel, and let's get into it.
There have been a lot of great male stables in wrestling. Hell, we could spend all day listing off even the most modern factions here. We're talking about names like the Bloodline
Oh, hold on. I'll be right back, guys. We are back.
and the Judgment Day. But what about the ladies? Haven't they had their fair share of great stables over the years too? Why, yes they have, and it's those groups we're going to be taking a look at right now, starting with Team PCB. Yes, it was back in the spring of 2015 that after 3 of the 4 horsewomen were called up to the WWE main roster, the company began embarking on its women's revolution, with this being the time that women were going to be given more opportunity. And while this would eventually lead to the likes of Becky Lynch breaking out and main eventing WrestleMania, at the start, things were a little rocky. Why was that? Well, because during those early months, WWE decided to go with something of a gang wars storyline between the ladies by splitting them off into various factions which met with mixed results. Of the ones that arguably worked out the best though, you could put Team PCB at the top of that list. And the reason for this was because Team PCB would be made up of Paige, Charlotte Flair, and Becky Lynch. And all these women have impressive resumes, and Paige
What an odd trio, though.
was in many ways the godmother of the women's revolution in WWE, with it being her early work down in NXT, which arguably kickstarted the whole thing. And when it comes to her 2 stablemates, well, they would reach such heights they'd end up becoming 2/3 of the first ever women's WrestleMania main event. So to have them all in one stable then was always going to be a recipe for success. And that success would include Charlotte becoming Divas Champion for the first time while a member of the group. Yes, this trio did a lot during their brief time together. Unfortunately, though, that time would come to an end in the autumn of that same year, as it was then that Paige, in an act of jealousy over their success, decided to turn heel on her partner.
These microphones, I'm glad that they changed it, because I watched an episode of Raw, and I see that this thing is circular now. It's not like a square.
Time would come to an end in the autumn of that same year, as it was then that Paige, in an act of jealousy over their success, decided to turn heel on her partners and begin a blood feud with them. But Team PCB wouldn't be the only memorable trio which would come out of that early era of the WWE Women's Revolution. No, at the exact same time as they were forming, another group were doing the same, and they were one that would go by the name of Team Bad. Who were Team Bad? Well, they were also a trio, one made up of Sasha Banks, Naomi, and Tamina. That's right, there would only be one horsewoman on display here, but that didn't make them any less special, because while she may not have been a part of that legendary quartet, Naomi could also hold her own as well. And with the daughter of Superfly Jimmy Snuka being added to the mix to serve as the enforcer then, it all added up to a great stable, one which were, like Team PCB, able to use their brief time together to great success by running rampant over the women's division in WWE. That said, like with Team PCB, the trio of Sasha, Naomi, and Tamina wouldn't be a long-lived one. No, by the time 2016 came around, this group would also be dissolved, though it would have a comeback of sorts a few years later in 2022, as it was then that, while they weren't going by the moniker of Team Bad anymore, Banks and Naomi would reform as a duo and go on to become WWE Women's Tag Team Champions together. Sadly though, this run would also end abruptly when both women walked out of the company. And with the boss now a member of the AEW roster and Tamina all but retired, it seems unlikely we'll be getting any of the 3 reforming again anytime soon. One group modern-day fans can still enjoy, though, is the one which has dominated SmackDown and Raw throughout the 2020s. That's right, it's time to talk about Damage Control. Of course, back when Damage Control first formed, they were not in the same incarnation they were today. No, back in 2022, they were made up of Bayley, Io Sky, and Dakota Kai. And when those 3 women were all on the same page, they were quickly able to make waves on the SmackDown roster, as within a matter of mere months, they were already pretty much running the women's division there. And we mean that when we say it, because while it took Bayley a little while to win gold of her own, it didn't take long for Io Sky and Dakota Kai to become women's tag team champions. That said, as time went on, though, things began to change within the heel group, and this became even more pronounced when new members were added in the form of Kairi Sane and Asuka. Why did this change the dynamic so much? Well, because it led to Io asserting more power over things, something which made Bayley feel like she was slowly being usurped. Sure, some might have brushed this off as paranoia on her part at first, but over time her doubts were proven to be correct, as after winning the 2024 Royal Rumble, the role model would be booted from the stable, with this causing her to enter into a WrestleMania 40 WWE Women's World Title feud against the Genius of the Sky, where she was finally able to become a champion again herself. As for what Damage Control would do after this, well, they'd turn face. Yes, as it stands today, they're now on the good guy side of the alignment chart over on Raw. And while they no longer have any gold around their waists, we don't see them stopping anytime soon. But let's move away from present-day WWE women's stables for a moment and on to ones a bit further back in the past again, as it's traveling back to 2017 that we find our next entry, a trio known to fans at the time as the Riot Squad. That's right, it might seem like a long time ago now, but there was a point not that long ago when Liv Morgan was not one of the top acts in the WWE women's division. Rather, she was just one.
It was almost 10 years ago, so yeah, I would say it's a long time ago.
Third of a stable, and not even the main member at that. No, she was very much playing second fiddle to the group's namesake, Ruby Riott. And as for the third member, Sarah Logan, well, she'd also be in a backup role. Not that this was something the trio were unhappy with, of course. No, they all seemed very happy to fulfill their roles, as in doing so, they were able to make the Riot Squad a dominating force on the SmackDown women's division for a while. Seriously, it didn't matter who they went up against, whether it be Charlotte Flair, Becky Lynch, Naomi, or anyone else. Whenever this group of heels were around, you could guarantee they were going to get theirs before the end of the night.
I do wonder, though, like, this is the best female factions. What are the best male factions?
And that worked out well for them then, well enough that they were eventually able to get scouted by Raw and called over there as a collective in 2018. Sadly though, this would also mark the beginning of the end for the Riot Squad because, while things might have started out strong for them there, what with them feuding with the likes of Sasha Banks and Bayley, by the time 2019 came around, the group would be all but disbanded when Ruby Riott suffered an injury. And when Ruby returned, it wasn't like the trio would go back to their old ways. No, at this point, the team would implode when the Michigan native faced off against Liv Morgan, all while Sarah Logan was forced to play the role of special guest referee. Yes, it was a sad end for the once mighty group, and given the fact that Ruby now works for AEW as Ruby Soho, it doesn't seem like there's going to be a Riot Squad reunion on the cards again anytime soon. But just because it's over doesn't mean all three haven't gone on to bigger and better things because, like we just said, Ruby Soho is currently working for AEW and enjoying her time there. Liv Morgan has become one of the most focused upon acts on Raw during the last year while she's feuded with Rhea Ripley, and Sarah Logan has fallen on her feet again as Valhalla, the manager of the Viking Raiders.
What?
So let's leave the Riot Squad behind for now and look to that other heel women's group who briefly made life a living hell for Charlotte Flair back during 2017 SmackDown. Who are we talking about here? Why, the Welcoming Committee, of course. Now, the Welcoming Committee might not be a name which jumps out as much as the Riot Squad or Damage Control when it comes to well-known female stables in WWE. Not because they didn't do plenty while they were around, of course. No, it was more because they were only around for a very brief window of time. It all started in 2017 when Charlotte Flair was drafted over to the SmackDown roster. At that point, before she found herself in the crosshairs of Ruby Riott and friends, she'd first find herself dealing with a collective of heels who wanted to welcome her to the show in the only way they knew how, with violence. Who were the women who made up this collective? Well, that would be Natalya, Carmella, and Tamina, with Lana effectively serving the role of valet. And then there was James Ellsworth there too, as Carmella's personal backup. But why did the Welcoming Committee feel the need to target the Queen? Well, the reason for this was that they felt that Charlotte coming in and immediately getting a title shot was unfair. And they also chose to go after the likes of Becky Lynch and Naomi. However, in the end, it would be choosing to target these two women as well, which led to their downfall, as after a short-lived run, the era of the Welcoming Committee would come to an end when they lost to the trio of Lynch, Naomi, and Flair multiple times throughout the spring. Of course, it's not always on the main roster that notable women's factions form in WWE though. No, sometimes we've had similar things happen down in developmental too. In fact, it was back in 2021 that one of these first
Right.
presented the
this one rated higher than these other ones.
themselves when Toxic Attraction took over the women's division in NXT for a while. And this one was a big deal at the
Or
time
is it not in order?
because it was very representative of the
I
new
hope it's
direction NXT was going in as it moved away
kinda
from the
late.
black and gold era and on to the 2.0 era. Yes, this group featured a trio of women with Gigi Dolan, JC Jane, and NXT
you
was
say
going.
NXT?
This one was a big deal at the time because it was very representative of the new direction NXT was going in as it moved away from the black and gold era and on to the 2.0 era. Yes, this group featured a trio of women with Gigi Dolan, JC Jane, and Mandy Rose being people WWE were looking to do big things in the future. And very quickly, the women's division started to revolve around them. Hell, it wouldn't be long after she arrived on the developmental show as part of her excursion from the main roster that Mandy Rose would become NXT Women's Champion. And as for Dolan and Jane, well, they'd be no slouches when it came to winning gold either, as during the time the group was together, they'd become NXT Women's Tag Team Champions on 2 separate occasions. Sadly though, this one would come to an untimely end when, in December of 2022, Mandy was fired from the promotion. And while the other 2 members of Toxic Attraction would continue for a little while after that,
Why?
soon they'd come to blows too, ending the stable once and for all. But they wouldn't be the only heel stable of women NXT had during the 2.0 era. No, in recent times, another trio has made their presence felt in Florida, with that one being Fatal Influence. Who are Fatal Influence? Well, they're a group made up partly out of the remains of Toxic Attraction in many ways, as they feature none other than JC Jane. Rather than have Mandy Rose and Gigi Dolan by her side this time, though, the Tampa native has surrounded herself with 2 newer acts in the form of Fallon Henley and Jasmine Nix. And Fatal Influence have certainly been able to make their presence felt on the developmental brand over the last year or so. Sure, you could argue this hasn't worked out quite as well for them as it did Jane's prior stable, especially when you consider they've never held either the NXT Women's title or the Women's Tag Team titles quite yet. But even if that is the case, it's not like they've held no gold at all. No, as it stands right now, Fallon Henley is the current North American Women's Champion, with it looking like this run is setting her up to be the breakout star of the trio. And who knows, maybe there could be a world title in her future. Will Jasmine Nix get her time in the sun too? It's entirely possible. After all, it's not as if Fatal Influence looks as if they're ready to split up anytime soon. And JC Jane might be due for another run with some gold before all is said and done. And who knows? After that, maybe they'll all move up to the main roster together as a unit to take on someone like Damage Control or our next subjects, Pure Fusion Collective. And PFC certainly have all the credentials to go in the ring once the bell rings. Yes, none of them are quite main eventers. All the credential
default
subjects,
GTA
Pure
walk.
Fusion Collective. And PFC certainly have all the credentials to go in the ring once the bell rings. Yes, none of them are quite main eventers yet, but they all have good levels of skill, whether this be in pro wrestling or in shoot fighting. After all, both Shayna Baszler and Sonya Deville are former MMA fighters, and when it comes to Zoe Stark,
Damn.
well, while she might not be a killer in the octagon, she has proven herself down in NXT where she became a tag team champion with Io Shirai. Really then, all this trio should need in order to reach the top of the card is some time, as if given enough opportunities to shine, there's no reason they shouldn't be draped in gold before long. In the meantime though, the PFC are going to have to continue working their way up the ranks by battling it out with the likes of the Unholy Union and Damage Control, building up wins each time they do until the point comes when they can no longer be denied. And if they can do this, it should only be a matter of time before tag team gold at very least comes their way.
Damn.
But then Sonya Deville should be all too aware about what it takes to be a part
I'm not gonna lie. Some of these like backstage like skits. I don't know if it's a skit or you know, what is it? Bits. I don't know. But some of them are actually
of a
entertaining.
successful their way. Can do this, it should only be a matter of time before tag team gold at very least comes their way. But then Sonya Deville should be all too aware about what it takes to be a part of a successful all-women stable in WWE. After all, she did this once before when she was a member of Absolution back in the day. Now, Absolution is another one you might not remember right away because they weren't around for too long, But for the brief period they were in act over on the Raw brand in late 2017 and early 2018, they'd certainly made an impact. So how did this one come about then? Well, it all began when, in November of the prior year, after having spent a significant period on the shelf with an injury, Paige made her grand return to WWE, and this time, she wasn't coming alone. Not that she'd have her previous stablemates of Becky Lynch and Charlotte Flair with her here. No, both of those women had moved on to other things by then. So instead, the Norwich native would bring Mandy Rose and Sonya Deville on board, and with the three of them now a united front, they'd set about making Monday nights their personal playground as they went after the likes of Sasha Banks, Bayley, and Mickie James. Unfortunately, though, any momentum Absolution were able to build would be destroyed by the time the summer of 2018 came around, as that was when a neck injury suffered during a live show match forced Paige into temporary retirement, with this being the last time she'd ever be live show match. Time the summer of 2018 came around,
the shit out of her.
as that was when a neck injury suffered during a live show match forced Paige into temporary retirement, with this being the last time she'd ever be featured in an in-ring capacity while employed by WWE. Still, at least it wasn't the complete end of Absolution when this happened. No, the group would continue in a way, just this time with 2 members instead of 3. Yes, it was after renaming themselves Fire and Desire that Mandy Rose and Sonya Deville would continue to tag with one another, and that would continue to be the case all the way up until 2020, at which point the pure charisma of Otis was enough to tear them apart as Mandy fell hopelessly in love with the big man. So now that we've covered Absolution's rise and fall, let's move over to another company for a while, namely TNA. And the reason we want to do that is because it's there that our next female faction can be found, the one known as the Beautiful People. That's right, the Beautiful People, the group most probably think of first when they think of female factions from Nashville. And the reason for that is because during the time this group was together, they certainly managed to make an impact. But then when we're talking about something which was formed by Angelina Love and Velvet Sky back in December of 2007, this shouldn't come as a surprise, as they were always December of 2007. This shouldn't come as a Angelina Love and Velvet Sky back in December of 2007. This shouldn't come as a surprise, as they were always 2 performers who loved nothing more than the spotlight being on them. Of course, they wouldn't be the only people to join the Beautiful People's ranks over the years, though. No, as time went on, they'd add more to the roster as they fully lent into the idea that they were TNA's version of the Mean Girls. And some of the names who would come on board at this point would be Madison Rayne, Lacey Von Erich, and Cute Kip. That's right, Daddy Ass himself, Billy Gunn, would become a member of the Beautiful People for a while, playing the role of valet. And that meant he'd be right there at ringside to watch along as they feuded with the likes of Taylor Wilde, ODB, Roxy, and Tara. Would the heel group find much success in these bouts? Of course they would. In fact, during their run, together they'd hold the Knockouts Tag Team Championships on 2 separate occasions, all while members Angelina Love and Madison Rayne were holding the Knockouts World title on 6 separate occasions between them. As you can probably guess, though, over time, the run of the Beautiful People would fizzle out as members left, feuded with the group, returned again, and that was why by the time 2016 came around, the once mighty stable would be calling it a day once and for all. But while this might have seemed like a big loss for the TNA women's division, it wasn't like this was the last notable female-led faction that the company would have. No, during the Beautiful People's final days, in fact, they'd get to feud with a group who would in many ways pick up the mantle from them, the Dollhouse. Who were the Dollhouse? Well, they were a group made up of Taryn Terrell, Marty Bell, Rebel, and Jade, aka Mia Yim, and they formed in the summer of 2015 with the intention of becoming the new top heel faction in TNA. How would this go for them? Pretty well. Yes, after making short work of early opponents such as Awesome Kong, Christy Hemme, and Laura Dennis, it wouldn't be long before this group were finding themselves in the orbit of the then top dogs of the division, the Beautiful People. So given this was around the time the Beautiful People disbanded once and for all, the Dollhouse would come out of the feud which followed on top. And that left the whole women's division down in Nashville open for them to take what they wanted from. So that's just what they did, as by this point, Awesome Kong herself had come on board and assumed the role of leadership over the now exiled Taryn Terrell for the simple reason that she was Awesome Kong and no one had the guts to tell her she wasn't the one in charge. Unfortunately for her, though, her time as the boss in the Dollhouse would be short-lived, as in February of 2016, she'd be released from TNA. So because of that, the heel group, which was now made up of Bell, Yim, and Rebel, was left rudderless. and this would all contribute toward them fully collapsing a few months later and breaking up completely. Still, even if the era of the Dollhouse had come to an early end, it didn't mean their members wouldn't be able to parlay the work they did here onto bigger and better things for themselves. Hell, in the years which followed, two of their former members, Awesome Kong and Rebel, would go on to get jobs with AEW, and Mia Yim would join WWE, the place she still works to this day as Mi Chin. So while the Dollhouse was relatively short-lived, its legacy still lives on to this day. And that, in many ways, is the true mark of a successful stable. But let's leave TNA behind for a moment and return to WWE again, more specifically to the Attitude Era WWF, as it's there we find our next notable female faction, Pretty Mean
What faction was the biggest problem?
Sisters. That's right, back during the late 90s, if you were looking for an all...
Because I don't know. So which one, in your guys' opinion, which faction was a problem?
All-girl stable, then Pretty Mean Sisters, or PMS for short, was the biggest name in the biz. Complete joke or anything. No, when it came to at least one of their members, Jacqueline, she was a very serious in-ring performer, even if this was something she didn't always get to show on TV at that time. And while the other key member of PMS, Terry Runnels, was never exactly a maestro on the level of Charlotte Flair, she was certainly a very over character back at the turn of the millennium. And so that meant that, when the pair began teaming up in late 1998 to make life a living hell for anyone they could, they'd be able to have a nice little run for themselves, one which eventually allowed them to not only include a third member in Ryan Shamrock, but also a valet and their own personal love slave, Meat. That said, the thing this group probably remains most remembered for today is their feud with Val Venus. You know the one. It was the time Terry claimed that Val was the father of her unborn child, only for Val to then counter this accusation by saying it couldn't be his kid, as he'd had a vasectomy. And the Val Venus saga, combined with Terry deciding to exhaust Meat prior to his matches by spending too much time with him, soon led to frustration developing between her and Jacqueline. And in the end, that was what caused the Pretty Mean Sisters to break up for good. What would each woman do after this? Well, Ryan Shamrock would pretty much be gone, Terry Runnels would remain an on-screen character with WWE for a few more years, and as for Jacqueline, well, she'd stay in WWE for a while longer too, all before moving over to TNA, where she became a member of Beer Money Inc. for a while. That said, for some fans, PMS remains the most memorable thing either woman ever did. And that's exactly why they're on today's list, just as every other memorable women's faction we've looked at.
Alright, well, again, if you guys, well, I want your guys' opinion on which faction you guys think is the one that was the biggest problem. What I mean by biggest problem was the one that was always, the faction that was always interrupting matches, always attacking people in the back, in the backstage. That sounded crazy. I'm glad I fixed that. But yeah, really enjoyed this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.